I'm just going to give you a really, really quick introduction to what on earth I'm talking about when I say that I lead a human-centered design science team, so that hopefully you can ask lots of questions about it. I'm going to start with our Directors General in 2015 had a dream. It's a good way to start a speech, right? They had a dream. They also actually kind of had a bit of a nightmare. So there was a wonderful Director General for Policy, Jeremy Moore, who was getting to the end of his career, getting towards retirement, and there were just things that frustrated him about the same mistakes that we made again and again, and also a realization that in the 21st century, with a world that was increasingly interdependent, complex, radically uncertain, had we really made use of all of the capability out there in order to enable our department to deliver its services and run a pretty big chunk of government as well as it possibly could? So he and the second Director General was Kevin Cunnington, who is the reason that I'm here today, because he helped get me on the agenda when he was Director General for Business Transformation at DWP before he went on to run Government Digital Service. So what did it mean to build organisational capability for the 21st century? Well, could we find a way to unblock progress on the really knotty problems? Things like social care, disability employment, things that were sort of perennial problems in the department. The department was very economics heavy. We'd let economics do the heavy lifting for a really long time. And so Jeremy in particular was thinking, what if we brought other disciplines to the policymaking table? Psychology, sociology, anthropology. And he noticed that I had a PhD in psychology, even though I'd been in the department sort of 10 years doing various things in research and policy roles. But that did make the way that I did things a little bit different. And Kevin thought we really needed to bring user-centered thinking beyond digital, because if you were building a digital service and you had a policy person in there and you said, okay, what's the policy intent? And it wasn't really developed and articulated in such a way that you could really integrate that with user-centered thinking and modern design practices. So it felt like, can we drive that up into the policy-making process? And so to put it technocratically, we needed to identify and mitigate a wider range of risks, especially long-term. So this is the mission that they gave me. We started with a team of social scientists, the anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists that I was talking about. We were a bit maverick. I had a bit of a reputation for being a bit disruptive, so was well up for this crazy job. And we were lucky enough to be able to start off in a very unusual way. So we started with a problem-centered approach rather than a set of tools. So the problems along the lines that the ones that I've already articulated, and I'll get to our specific problem statement in a minute. We had a remit across the entire department. So this is one of the biggest parts of government. It's the best part of 90,000 people. We have a huge delivery arm, and I was given basically permission to meddle in everything. I was based in policy, but could look across the piece. And to experiment, to try things out. We spent the whole of 2016 mucking things up safely and figuring out what kinds of things worked. We had a precedent that anchored us when we didn't know what to do. It's like, what would we have done in the case of one of the most successful programs the department has ever landed? And this at the time was automatic enrollment into workplace pensions. Also, one of the biggest applications of psychological thinking anywhere in policymaking, and itself the reason why I joined the department in 2006 from the private sector. We took a magpie approach to methods in the team. We said, right, well, let's go out and see who else is wrestling with the same problems. Who's got some ideas we haven't tried before? Can we beg, borrow, adapt, make up, steal, and make use of the ideas that the private sector are using, that academia are using, that other thought leaders are using? And actually, ministers love this stuff. So our pitch to ministers is to start off by saying, okay, if you want better outcomes, let's look at the whole system. And in a nutshell, the system is ministers set goals, DWP does some stuff. It takes action. It creates strategies, systems, internal processes. It changes the decision-making environment. People respond to that. People in the real world, whether that's our own staff, whether it's claimants, whether it's doctors writing a fit note to say somebody is fit or not fit to work. And our incredible army of analysts, one of the biggest strengths of our department, measure where we've got to. And if you've got a gap between the box on the left and the box on the right, it's easy to blame people's choices, to say, oh, if only people would just behave correctly. But actually, although you can push people's behavior around a little bit, why don't we look at the second box? Why don't we look at how we designed those strategies, systems, and processes in the first place, and where people were responding in ways we didn't like? Why don't we see if we can improve the assumptions that we make about people in that process of design? And that was a bit of an in for me as a psychologist and a social scientist. So really, our mission was to solve a particular problem, which is that DWP sometimes makes decisions based on inaccurate assumptions about people. And over time, we've experimented, as I say, with a lot of different approaches, and the things that we find are most consistently useful fall under one of the following headings. And I'm not going to say that this is the end of the journey, but after 9 years, this is what we find gives us most additional value, and you need all of it blended together. User-centered design. I learned that from the private sector. Also, agile project management. That allows you to deal with uncertainty. Systems thinking puts it in the context of an overall system. Social science, I have drawn a lot on my own background there. The concepts, actually doing qualitative research, quantitative research of all different kinds, ethnography in particular. And we also throw in some standard tools from the behavioural science toolkit, particularly something called COM-B, which I can answer questions about if you're interested in. Otherwise, look it up. Susan Mickey has done lots and lots of work on this and popularised it during the pandemic. And also strategic analysis tools, things like SWOT analysis. So we use all of those. But we find that most tools need adapting to work in our context. But also we need to adapt the context in order to make use of those tools from outside. Very few things translate directly. So I'll give you a quick case study. So back in 2017, one of my deputy director colleagues in policy came to me with one of these knotty problems, one of these problems that's in the too hard box. And that was a good opportunity for us to go and play around with it and see if we could make it better. And his was that if we're going to get people to work longer, one of the reasons that they don't, one of the reasons that they leave the labour market early is because of caring responsibilities. And he said, we've got lots of things in place for supporting people who've been caring, how to get them back into work. We've got things in place while people are caring full time, things like carers allowance. But what about preventing people feeling forced to leave the labour market because of caring when they don't want to? And we had lots of anecdotal evidence that people wished they hadn't left. And I have been a carer myself, and I could certainly relate to those reports. And of course, this falls on women in their 50s and 60s, huge impact on their pensions. A lot of people never come back if they leave during a caring crisis. And with an aging population, this was only going to get worse. So my team thought about this from a user-centered design perspective. So let's take the case of a persona called Caroline. This is how the department would normally have thought about this problem, even taking a user-centered design approach. Caroline requests flexible working. She's a carer. Her employer says no, so she ends up leaving work to care. But we thought, let's take this in a whole systems perspective. Let's bring all of the different government departments together, and let's think about, from her perspective, where did this all begin? I know that for the Department for Work and Pensions, we're going to focus on the employment bit because it's what we do, and it's because where the outcome is. But what if we go a bit further up? Her dad, who she's looking after, he's called Dave. He develops care needs. That's where her journey started. Caroline makes decisions about caring for her dad early on in a crisis without a great deal of support, long before she considers herself a carer, about how she's going to combine care and work. She muddles along. She doesn't necessarily have the best conversations with the medics about her dad's prognosis. She maybe doesn't have early conversations with her employer, maybe very difficult conversations amongst the family themselves. Very little support there, and she doesn't think of herself as a carer. So this was all still at the hypothetical, imaginal stage. And what we were coming to the conclusion as a group of policymakers and analysts from across the whole of government, we did this across silos, was that maybe carer and caring isn't a static demographic like being a man or woman or in a certain age. It's a complex social practice. And a portion of the journey, the user journey, had been neglected. So as good scientists, we said, right, we're going to test our hypothesis that people are making early decisions without really understanding their needs, their entitlements, or the longer-term implications of those decisions. And they're getting information from all over the place, not just government sources. So we're going to have to do this collectively. And I could talk for way longer about this, and I don't have time, so I'm just going to have to really quickly summarize here. We spent 2 years on a discovery process. We found the framing of it in terms of discovery really, really helpful. And we developed a bunch of assets in that time. We developed a real insight into working pre-carers or potential carers' experiences. Remember, this is a group nobody had paid attention to before, but every working person who has a family, everyone in this room, could be a potential carer, could be a pre-carer. We developed an ideal user journey. So actually, what would good have looked like at all those stages? And most people weren't experiencing good. Let's map out all of the information that's provided across all these different organizations, and found that nobody was really meeting these needs, and took a systems perspective in terms of what is causing and what is the result of the problem that we're talking about. We built a supportive and motivated group of stakeholders across all of these sectors, from local authorities to condition-specific charities, carers charities, all oriented around this new version of the problem. And this has led to some concrete outputs, although we're far from done yet. During the pandemic, we produced a leaflet for the NHS that notably helped support people who were carers or might be about to become carers. Remember, lots of people were becoming sick and more disabled, but they might not identify as that. So we produced a leaflet that did not include the word carer as in the headline. And we've also more recently added a page to our DWP Job Help campaign website that really talks to people about their decisions around working while supporting someone's health or care in a really human way, that talks about things like, have you thought about how you're going to talk about this to the person you're caring for? Where can you get support for that? And talks to you in a much more empowering way that leaves all of the options open and supports you through that process. So reflecting back on this in the context of this conversation today, old approaches weren't cracking this problem. We chucked everything we had at this. We found that Agile was really useful. I frame this in terms of discovery, and I'd say that we're in alpha to beta now. User-centered design approaches, co-design, you'll have noticed, came in there as well. But we often needed to change those. So things like voting dots, when it came to selecting things, weren't really going to cut it. We needed to be able to articulate exactly how we'd come to the decisions we had. And also, user-centered is really tricky when the user group doesn't recognize that it exists. You have to do some more sophisticated social research techniques in order to be able to try and get at unconscious and outside of awareness problems that people are wrestling with and unmet user needs. And we took that systems approach to outcomes, leadership, and scope, really owning the whole of this problem. Otherwise, it'd been very easy to narrow in and say, let's build an app to help people with this small bit of the problem. But that wasn't what was needed. What was needed is to wrap our arms around these unmet user needs as a government and draw in people to support the different elements of that. Wasn't easy to do. It's been a lot of fun. It's been very rewarding. But actually working in these sorts of ways across boundaries and inventing the ways in which we were going to solve these problems as we went along took a great deal of resilience on the part of everyone involved. But I have a very, very committed team to this. Once people get on board with this way of working, they find that it's very addictive. So I will leave it there. Time for Peter to run you through his work.
Thank you so much, Carla.
Wow.
Oh, you want this?
Thank you, Carla. So many interesting both techniques and also what a brilliant case study. So thank you. I'm going to hand over to Peter, who's going to talk us through his work in Slovenia.
Hi, it's actually an honor to be here. What an amazing event and what an amazing presentation by Carla. Wow. My name is Peter Pogačar and I'm from Slovenia. I'm Director General at the Ministry of Public Administration, and when I was asked about this title, what can governments learn from other sectors on delivery, I thought of my personal experience. In my career, I used to be a director of the insurance company in private sector. We had a lot of customers, a lot of delivery. And now for the last 10, 15 years, I'm Director General at the Ministry of Public Administration. So I can really have this personal experience. But in Slovenia, we don't think that private sector and public administration, that they are so much different. They're both part of the same society. And within Ministry of Public Administrations, like a couple of years ago, we said like, okay, what will future look like? What will influence the future of Slovenia, the future of society, both private sector and public administration? So we identified the so-called drivers of change. You see them up, and I don't have time to explain for everything. But those drivers of change...
Take your clicker.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. Okay. Okay, I got it.
Okay, got it. There you go.
Yeah. Okay. So those drivers of change will influence the nature of policy making and how the public administration works, and will also create a pressure for changing the internal structure of public administration. You see those drivers of change for Slovenia, and they're practically the same for all developed world. Of course, technology, automation, labor markets, climate change, governments and institutions, demographics. Of course, demographics, this is the most important. Just two examples of close cooperation. When we talk about demographics, Slovenia is facing strong demographic challenge. Usually we think about, okay, of course, that will put an extra pressure on our healthcare system, long-term care system, pension expenditure. But it will also influence the labor market with the lack of workforce. It will influence the issue of migration policy. The same goes with technology and automation. It's amazing. Rapid changes in both sectors, decreasing numbers of jobs because of digitalization, the role of artificial intelligence. Okay, private sector is extremely successful when it comes to digital services, digital delivery. But for who? For the customers, not for the whole population. If the whole population is not timely equipped with digital skills, those digital services will not be used. But whose job it is to equip population with digital skills? That's a job for the public administration. Private sector will not do it because it's not cost efficient. That's one of the differences. And then 4 years ago, Slovenia, as the rest of the world, were facing pandemic crisis. It was the first major crisis. And what has proved in that time was that actually public administration was really agile, responsive. Actually, the trust, the reputation of public administration really increased during the pandemic in Slovenia. We were there for the people. We performed much better than the private sector. So, actually, what have we learned? That this, with drivers of change, the most important value for the future for both, for private sector, public administration, will be the resilience of the system. Because like 5 years ago, who could predict the pandemic? Who could plan the pandemic? And then, okay, pandemic is over, then it was energy price crisis. And then it was war in Ukraine crisis. I can't remember anymore which was how they were scheduled, but it's crisis after crisis after crisis. So it's actually the resilience of the system. And this is where the public administration is better than private sector. This is where we can learn from each other. But up until now, and this is the case for Slovenia, and probably also for other member states, other countries, we always plan the future on past events, past experience. But this is outdated. The future cannot be planned. It must be anticipated. I'm sure we cannot anticipate everything, but we can learn. We can learn more. So actually, we have to learn how to handle crisis, not just how to handle this particular current crisis. And that brings me to present to you with one specific project that lasts for a couple of years now in Slovenia, and it's really a successful cooperation between private sector and public administration. It's actually a national platform, and it's called Partnership for Change. It means that actually the idea was, let's break down stereotypes about the public administration. Let's break down the stereotypes about the private sector. In Slovenia, the major stereotypes of public administration are low efficiency, low motivation, of course, lack of goal orientation, excessive bureaucracy, and siloed organization with hierarchy. And of course, when it comes to the private sector, the main stereotypes are just profit for the shareholders, right? Short-term goals orientation, pursuing interests, and just demands without considering the bigger picture of society. Those are the stereotypes in Slovenia. But actually, these are just the stereotypes. My opinion is, and what we can learn from each other, is public administration can learn from private sector about how to put customer in the center. That they are amazing about it. How user experience, user-friendly products. I love my bank digital services. I haven't been in that big building physically for like last 10 years. It's amazing. And about efficient processes. But what can private sector learn from public administration is resilience, crisis management, inclusive services. Private sector can afford to bring up digital services just for the customers. Public administration needs to provide digital services for the whole population, regardless of socioeconomic status, regardless of location of this person. So this is the difference. This is what they can learn from us. And of course, also the long-term planning. So actually, with this Partnership for Change, actually what this project is all about, it means exchange between employees in the public, private, and non-governmental organization. It's a project that allows every year we are offering to the employees of public administration, to the employees of public sector, to go physically work in the private sector. And so actually last month, we had a person from major insurance company working at the Ministry of Public Administration. And some people, my colleagues from Ministry of Public Administration or other ministries, are regularly going to work like for 5 days on the field in the private sector. The results are amazing. Actually, it's a field training. It's building a culture of cooperation among them. So actually, it's built a culture of cooperation. It really creates positive stories. It's between the public and private sector. And what is most important, this network, and it's a national platform, it raises trust between the two sectors from bottom up. What were the results of this Partnership for Change, this project? It's cooperation, it's trust, it's breaking down the stereotypes, it's learning from each other, and what is my personal favorite results of this project, which is really amazing, is that we finally started to understand each other. The private sector understands public administration, and public administration, okay, we don't understand them yet, but we're trying to understand the sector. But let me conclude with this. When we talk about digital services, whether it is in private sector, whether it is in public administration, let us not forget that at the end, all the services, all the results of the company, it's private, public administration, at the end, it all depends on the people, on the employees. So actually, the main challenge is in each sector, how to put the right people in the right places, because let us not forget, it is all about the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, both of you. Both of you, really interesting, thought-provoking presentations, and particularly whilst you were talking about very different things, both of you had people at the centre of all of it. And I think that has been, I guess, the thread that has run through so many of the conversations on so many of the stages today, that innovation is actually all about the people. I am going to open the floor to questions. Does anyone have a question, a burning question? Yes, we've got one down here. Lady in the grey blazer.
Hi, my name's Carmen Ross and I'm for the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, and in the last couple of years I've worked a lot on the EDI strategy. For Carla particularly, one of the things I've noticed is for young carers, they're often quite missed in the population, are making choices based financially quite often on whether to stay in technical education or go into academic qualifications instead, because they still get funded up until the age of 18 if it's in academic but not in work, so then it leaves a bit of a gap. So I just wondered if you knew of anything that DWP was thinking of in that area specifically for young carers on the flip side.
So that's a very good specific question. There is work on young carers. This was obviously done in the context of preventing people from leaving the labour market largely in their 50s and 60s. So it's going to be a different set of user needs. But there's definitely, that I've been in lots of conversations where people have been saying, oh no, that's part of our young carers strategy. It's just not necessarily part of the particular remit of my work. So what I have been focused on, people who are already in work, when they became carers. A lot of young carers. I'm actually a trustee of a carers charity. So I'm aware of the different user journey. So I'm not going to be able to give you a hugely interesting answer to that. But yes, it is very much on the agenda, but requires different sets of interventions as far as I understand.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carla.
We've got two questions handily next to each other. There's a microphone there. Yes.
Hi, I'm Eleanor McCann from the Pensions Regulator, and a question for Peter. The public-private partnerships that you're talking about, the secondments, I'd anticipate challenges being raised around security and privacy of data as barriers to doing that. Did you have similar barriers, and how did you overcome them?
Can I just?
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, really interesting question because when the idea started with this national platform of exchanging public employees, all sorts of legal, IT security and everything. But we said, like, let's just keep it simple. Let's just build trust between each other. Who will have access to some data? How we will legally fix the contract? It's actually a voluntary exchange up to 5 days. It doesn't have a formal legal basis just for it. It's just assigning a contract between different employees, between the ministries, public administration, and specific private sector companies like major oil company, 2 or 3 major bank. Mostly they're from financial sector. So the whole idea and one of the benefits is that it's really not legally complicated. It's actually quite simple. I mean, my colleague, Thea, she's with me here. She participated in this program, and she just went there to some private HR company for a week. And it's an amazing, you should try it. It's an amazing experience for all the employees because it really breaks down the stereotypes. I remember people coming back from like major bank company, because this stereotype of how many people is working in the public administration, about 50% actually. And we have a stereotype that in banking sector, like 100% of employees is like working hours and that. Well, it's not true. Actually, it's a stereotype. So they're actually, even today, they're part of this platform, they're cooperating between each other, and it's really an amazing project. It's a great result.
Sound amazing, thanks.
I think it's a really interesting thing that you just said, that you raised, obviously, but that you've just said, which is that sometimes we add process to make things more difficult when actually, at the crux of it, what we're trying to do is build understanding. I'm thinking with my own personal hat on in my role, but thinking about how we build trust in public services, how we raise the morale of civil servants in the work that they do, and actually breaking down those silos to learn more about people in different sectors, the work that they're doing, and how you are impacting them by the decisions you make in government is really, really important. So I really like that idea that you just remove the bureaucracy and make it a really easy...
Well, it was not easy. Legal department was freaking out at that time, but we just did it.
Yeah, strong leadership, I think, is what Peter is saying there. We had a question just next door, yeah.
Hi, Gabe Fender from ThoughtWorks Consultancy, and it was more for Carla, kind of 2 related questions. So first, with your hypothesis, what were the measures that you kind of put in place for like what does good look like for that outcome? And then I guess second on that, the example you showed was really interesting about how you took carer out of the things that you were putting out there for help, and what's the result been so far for that?
So I just need a bit of clarification on the first question.
Yeah, so your hypothesis, how were you how are you measuring that? So how do you know that
How do I test it?
how do you test it, and how
Okay.
do you know that it's working?
Yeah. Well, the reason I tripped up over that is because there wasn't an outcome measure built into the hypothesis. The hypothesis that I put on the slide was that that there had been this process going on where carers were, well, pre-carers, potential carers were making decisions early on in their caring journey that were then constraining their options later, and that they weren't being fully informed. So that wasn't so much about an outcome, that was an idea about what was going on in people's lives that was hidden from view, even hidden from the charities, that we then needed to say, well, are we right about this? It hypothetically could be the case. So the way that we tested that was we commissioned Ipsos Mori to do 2 pieces of work. The first was to go out and find people who had had a family member develop care needs in the last 6 months, and ask them where they were looking for information, how they were thinking about the problem. And then we also went to actually the carers charity I'm now involved with, and asked them to find people who had been working at the start of their caring journey. In fact, they'd all at this point stopped working, but they were able to then so we did it prospectively and retrospectively, and to find out that actually there was evidence of this, and we were able to dig into it more to see how this process of managing what you call the shark nearest the boat went on. It's like, okay, we'll manage this bit, oh no, this is crisis, I can't do this anymore, I'm going to quit. Oh, I'm a carer, oh, there's support out there. At that point, it was too late. So that was the process of hypothesis measurement, which isn't the same as outcome measurement, as you appreciate. So then you were sort of saying, well, how do we know that our interventions are helping, especially the carer point? And the answer is that's really tricky to know. And so all you could do is to sort of pick up bite-sized chunks of questions in the way that we did, and then, for example, user test the leaflet and the website that I mentioned, that I displayed. Going out and seeing to people if those resonated and the right kinds of contexts did people find those useful, and then over time we can also, that the website's new, we can track usage of it. But in terms of the underlying goal, what we were after was for people to be able to make more informed decisions and ultimately stay and work longer. Obviously, we're not going to have that data for a long time, and if we did, we're not going to be able to know exactly what contributed to it. So that's why my approach tends to be to break off small chunks of things, map the logic of how those decisions would affect the long-term outcome, and see if we can make an impact on those, rather than assume that you can draw a line to the end outcome very easily.
Thank you. I think we had a couple of questions on this side, and then we've got one at the back over there, please.
Hi, Abida Rashid, HM Revenue and Customs. Carla, you mentioned very briefly that there was an ethnographic aspect to your research, so I'm just interested to hear a little bit more about that.
So that's, in general terms, in fact, we've even hired a PhD in anthropology who's an ethnographer. So we will use that in contexts like going into job centres is one of the ones we've done, to see what a day in the life of our colleagues on the front line looks like. Because we know that actually a lot of things that are really interesting about the things that drive people's choices are not things that necessarily they're particularly aware of, and they might well be in the environment around them. So where we can, we will go into environments and look at them. So that's one where we've then been able to turn that ethnography into sort of powerful visual displays that then help the rest of the organisation understand, okay, we think this is what's going on in our delivery arm. Actually, this is what it's really like.
Fantastic. I think question at the back here.
Yeah, I'm Olui Michael from DEFRA. So my question is directed at both Carla and Peter. In terms of the strategies that you were building around the carer, was legislation a barrier, and how did you overcome that? And both in the work that you did around the carer strategy and in the public-private partnership in Slovenia.
Okay, so...
Can you repeat the question, because I couldn't hear it?
Was legislation a barrier, and how did you overcome that?
Yeah, so Peter, do you want to go first? Was legislation a barrier to delivering the public-private partnership, and how did you overcome it?
Actually, it's about the legislation, of course. When we it's always like this in public administration. When we evaluate, when we think about starting projects, we are always thinking about, okay, but what about the legislation? But Okay, and this is like the barrier that can stop, that can deteriorate the whole project. But this is like, we're trying to change this because we can change the legislation. If it's not fit for the present time anymore, then change the legislation. But you need to know what you want to achieve. That's the main problem. We are long-term planning, but we have sometimes a lack of this goal orientation process. What is the goal? And then you need to sell it to the stakeholders.
Yeah.
But when you are selling it to the stakeholders, it's about the private-public partnership. You always need to think, this is what we needed to change. Not so much about the legislation, but about to persuade people that this is actually good. Because our tradition in Slovenia is also the cultural sample. We have a really strong public sector. And it's like a strong value for Slovenian, this public sector. So everything that would come for the public services from the private sector, it will be a problem for the regular Slovenian citizens, because our tradition is that we have a strong state, strong public sector. But actually, this is why it was so important that first we started with campaign, the messages, why the influence of the private sector, why the role of private sector is actually needed also in providing public services. But it's also the public opinion, it's connected with the stereotypes about that privatization of the public service. It's really a complex thing, and you need to have a broader decision that all the public services will not be provided from the public sector, but of course it will be under the authority of the public sector. But it's always a question, because people are afraid of privatization of public services, but it's also a question then for the public sector, for us we are working in public sector, why is private sector more efficient? Why they provide more quality services? So actually, when you persuade people that we only have like two options, either to transform public sector in providing more quality, more efficient services, or just outsource it to the private sector. But the truth is somewhere in between. So.
No, really, yeah, couldn't agree more. I think there is this interdependency, isn't there, in how do we learn from and replicate, but also how do we take some of those risks that the private, I guess there's something around public sector funding as well that plays into this, but how do you feel able to take risks, and how can you do that in that sort of that middle space, as you said, between private and public. Carla, would you be able to answer the question on whether legislation was a barrier for you in the work that you were doing?
Sure. So the short answer is no. Provision of information to people in the working carer scenario isn't governed by any particular regulations. It's produced by all different kinds of organisations. What I would say, actually, very much the way that Peter opened his answer is, start with it. So just as you might actually in a private sector organization, okay, what's the regulatory framework? What's our space for manoeuvre? It's exactly what we would do in the case of this problem. Say, okay, we've got a problem of people dropping out of the labour market due to caring. What are the constraints? What are what I would call footholds for change? What's our room for manoeuvre? And actually, one of the things we did as we started to develop our understanding of this problem was we got all the stakeholders together and we said, right, let's map all the barriers to getting that ideal user journey that I talked about, and then let's pick two barriers to work on. One that is kind of a quick win that we can do quite quickly. So some of those pieces of information would fall under that. And then one, like, what if we really remove this barrier? What would that really do? And I think I would encourage that generally when it comes to innovative change, have one quick win that keeps the momentum and one serious barrier that you're going to work on that will make a long-term difference. And really for that it's collectively thinking differently about carers would be one of those that sort of longer-term structural things that we would want to see changed. That's a continuing dialogue between the public sector and various elements of the private and third sector. So, but there are cases where we might be involved in something that is going to end up with legislation. So I talked about automatic enrolment into workplace pensions, which involved 2 acts of parliament, of which I was involved in a chunk of it. So it really depends on what the problem is and what is the political context in which you're trying to solve that.
Indeed. We've got a question over there, and then one down here, and then one right at the front, please.
My name is Jacek Kornak. I work for DBT. I wanted to ask a little bit more about this experiment with private and public sector. Well, it all sounds great, like in abstract terms, but actually, like, you know, in the UK, the difference sometimes in pay between a same job that you do in a public sector and private sector would be like 300%. How do you actually like ensure that like you send someone to do a job for 5 days in a bank and this person would not come back demotivated and would quit and apply to that bank? Like, and we talk about efficiency. Actually, I think part of the answer to the question of efficiency is the pay gap, that it's massive in the UK. I don't know, maybe in Slovenia, salaries are more even between private and public. But if we want to kind of, you know, compare those 2 sectors, we should also talk that, okay, we want to do our best, but also we want to be rewarded in some kind of comparable way. So how do you ensure that this experiment doesn't actually like fail and people would come back to your office and say that, like, you know, I would work even less because like I see how are people rewarded in bank, in other institutions?
Wow. No, actually, that was actually my concern, that they may never come back to the ministry. But actually, first of all, in Slovenia, the gap, the pay gap between the private and public administration is not that high. That's one challenge. The second is that it was amazing for some people who came from the financial industry to work at the ministry, and later their response was that they realized that people at the ministry, that they are actually doing a job that in some way can make society better, that it will influence the people's life. This is what you do at the ministry, you're creating policy. Yeah, and so this is the line I use at the job interview when I want to attract talent. Of course, the wages will always be higher in private sector, but mostly they are not that much different, as you say. In UK, in Slovenia is, of course, in financial sector, average wage is higher. But this was not the case, actually. So we don't have an experience that some person would, after like 5 days, being in the field in some insurance company, coming back and say like, oh, you just don't pay me enough, you know, for what I'm working here. This is not the case. But he brought some new ideas. He saw that, because maybe from some people that I interviewed them about their experience, they said like, I was like looking at those guys at the banking sector, they're so much better, they're working really hard, they're creative. And then he realized that also at the ministry, we are not that bad. So it was actually also the different, the opposite effect. So I don't, but of course, you don't get a salary for those 5 days from the banking or telecommunication. You still get the salary from the ministry, unfortunately. Yeah. Actually, but it was really not the case, because it was only 5 days. And actually, what was really, maybe I didn't mention it, what was really important was that after you participate in this program, you are included in this national platform. And they're like a platform or communication. They have a regular meetings together, etc. So actually, this cooperation continues, but it's not the case that it would be about stealing talents from the ministry to hire them in the private sector. This is not the case.
Just to add to that, I think some of you were here for a previous session where we were talking about attracting talent and retaining talent in the public sector, and it was really interesting insight that came from a couple of the speakers from Belgium and from a recruitment company, and Fiona Ryland, who's Government Chief People Officer here, is that the purpose element and the value drivers that bring people to the public sector are very different. So whilst we all agree that compensation for the work that we do isn't necessarily where we'd like it to be in the public sector, there is a real drive in the reason why people join the public sector that is separate to the one why people will join the private sector. And that was really paraphrasing an hour-long session, but that was a really interesting bit of feedback.
Yeah,
On that.
maybe just add some comment. It's really about these values when we talk. We should focus also on, I don't know whether it was discussed, about the Z generation, the generation of my children. You know, they're finishing, they're at the universities now. Their values are much different. Their value of creating something better life for the future, for creating better society, it's really important value for them when picking the job. So maybe different from our generation,
Yeah.
fortunately.
Whereas I was all about the pension. We have a question at the front here.
Thank you very much. I'm Ruth Newick. I'm the Deputy Director of Transformation at the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. And I'm also a charity trustee of Age UK Barnet. So my question for both panellists is, what can we learn in central government from the charitable sector?
Who would like to
From
go
where?
first?
I need to think about
Okay,
that for a
yeah.
second.
From where?
From the charity sector.
Okay.
Do you have an answer, Peter?
Excuse me?
Do you have an answer, Peter? Do you want to go first?
No, I need to think.
Carla's having a think.
What can we learn from?
The charity sector, the third sector.
Charities.
Oh, non-governmental organizations.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I apologize. What can we learn? Actually, we can learn because we have a really strong non-governmental organization sector in Slovenia. It's non-governmental, but it's mostly financed through the state. Through the state budget, because we have special tenders when they can apply at the Ministry of Public Administration, and they do a lot of really positive stuff, not just charity, also raising the awareness among society about the equal treatment and everything. Of course, what can we learn? It's about the commitment they have. They're really like working for low wages. Wage is not something, paycheck is not something that would attract you to work at non-governmental organization. They are really flexible, they're really agile because they're living from usually through the finances from tender to tender. We have a really good experience also hiring at the public administration some people that started in non-governmental organization because they have a feeling what the real life looks like in the field, which is like different if you come straight from the university to the public administration. So yes, we can learn from them. We support non-government organization through the budget, either also when they not agree with the government. So, yeah.
Just to add to what Peter said, I think there's sometimes a step that we miss in how we engage from a stakeholder point of view with charities, and actually they have access to people who are accessing our services on a day-to-day basis. So how can we learn about how we can innovate, develop or create systems and services that are much more user-centred by actually working with them really closely on that. Carla, did you have anything to add?
Sure. I just needed to reflect on that moment, partly because I think what I've learned from being on the board of trustees has not been the right answer to that. It's like, oh, how do you do this? How do you support people when you've got a tiny charity with, well, moderate-sized one with a sort of turnover of $500,000, as opposed to my organisation, which is billions and billions. So that's been really interesting to see a sort of not dissimilar kind of service delivery. But actually, every reform I've ever worked on, we've needed it's almost like part of the infrastructures. You need the charities because they're the ones who can give the voice of people, with particularly people who might not otherwise have a voice because they're marginalised in some way or other. So I think that has been. It's crucial to understand what people will tell you when they're not dealing with the department, not dealing with the government. I mean, we have amazing frontline people who can learn an awful lot about what's going on in people's lives, but we're also the people that are asking you to write workplace, write claimant commitments about how you're going to go looking for work. There's lots of constraints that people are dealing with when they're dealing with our department. So even though we have our ears open, it's not going to be the same as the insight we get into people's lives when we work with charities. But it's been really interesting working on the Carers Project because you see the charities changing their views of themselves as well. So, we were Alzheimer's UK, and we were thinking about the patient. Actually, what about their families and how the support that they can provide to somebody who's having, whose dementia is progressing will change depending on what support we've offered to the carer. So actually their view, it was a mutually beneficial exchange of views by bringing all of those charities together.
Thank you. Again, I've got the red flashing light. So we are actually at the end of this session. Thank you all so much for attending. I think we learned a huge amount, and kudos to Carla and Peter for everything that they had to share. And I think the big thing that I've taken away from this is that it isn't just about one sector and another. It's actually about that system thinking about how we can solve the problem. And then particularly, how do we put the human, the people at the centre of everything that we do. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Carla. Thank you, Peter. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much.